The night Duke Cadric Blackmore destroyed a woman in front of 400 witnesses, he did not flinch. He did not stutter. He stood beneath the chandelier light of the royal winter banquet, glass raised, voice steady as a man reading weather reports, and he unmade a life with 11 words. The ballroom laughed. The woman did not move. And somewhere in the wreckage of that silence, something ancient and patient began to stir. What follows is the price of that night, every last coin of it. The chandeliers in the Grand Valmont banquet hall weighed 900 pounds each. Cadric knew this because he had once watched a servant fall from a ladder while cleaning one, and the man had grabbed the lowest crystal tier to save himself. The fixture did not move, not even a tremor. 900 pounds of Bohemian glass and iron, and it held a grown man without complaint. Cadric admired that. Weight that refuses to bend. He stood near the western colonnade, one hand resting on the marble balustrade, the other holding a glass of Brennan whiskey he had not yet tasted. Around him the royal winter banquet churned in its annual performance of silk, duplicity, and roasted pheasant. 400 guests, 12 courses. One purpose, to remind every noble house in the kingdom exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of relevance. Cadric Blackmore, Duke of the Eastern March, knew precisely where he stood, near the top, close enough to taste the apex, not yet close enough to claim it. He was 31, tall in the way that made lesser men conscious of their posture. His jaw was a line drawn by someone who did not believe in softness, and his eyes carried the particular shade of gray that court women described as magnetic and court men described as unsettling. He wore black because he understood that color was a statement, and black said, "I am not here to compete with your wardrobe. You are brooding again." Lord Harlan Voss appeared at his elbow, ruddy-faced and already half-drunk. Harlan was the kind of friend who survived proximity to Cadric because he was useful, occasionally honest, and never ambitious enough to be dangerous. "I am thinking," Cadric said. "Same thing, with you." Harlan took a swig from his own glass. "So, tonight is the night then. Tonight is a banquet. Tonight is the night you publicly destroy the woman who has waited 6 years for a ring. Do not dress it up." Cadric's jaw tightened. 1 degree. Anyone else would have missed it. "She was given expectations," he said. "I never gave promises." Harlan stared at him. "You gave her 6 years, Cadric. In what language is that not a promise?" "In the language of strategy." The word sat between them like a blade on a dinner table. Harlan drank again and looked away. Across the ballroom, Lady Seraphina Vale stood near the eastern windows, speaking with Countess Margot Delacroix. From this distance, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent half a decade sculpting herself into the perfect duchess. Her gown was the precise shade of midnight blue that complemented the Blackmore house colors without overshadowing them. Her posture was immaculate. Her smile was warm, practiced, and entirely genuine, which was the most dangerous thing about her. She actually believed in it. Cadric watched her for a moment longer than he intended. "She will recover," he said. "Will she?" "Women of her station always do." Harlan set down his glass. "You know, for a man with the sharpest mind in the Eastern March, you are spectacularly stupid about one thing." "And what is that?" "People are not chess pieces, Cadric. You cannot remove them from the board and expect them to sit quietly in a box." Cadric turned to face him. His expression was the one that made subordinates reconsider their sentences. "I did not ask for your moral inventory, Harlan." "No, you never do." The orchestra shifted to a waltz. Guests began pairing off on the marble floor, their movements choreographed by centuries of etiquette. Cadric straightened his coat. He checked his cufflinks. He did these things because small rituals calmed the machinery in his chest that was already spinning toward the moment he had calculated down to the quarter hour. He did not hate Seraphina. That was the thing nobody would understand. He did not hate her, and he did not love her, and the absence of both was the entire problem. She was a woman of good family, sharp intelligence, and a loyalty so absolute it had become a strategic liability. Marrying her would have been safe, comfortable. And comfort was a trap that swallowed ambitions whole. Lady Vivian Ashford had arrived at precisely 8 o'clock. He had seen her enter through the northern doors with her father, Marquess Ashford, whose political influence stretched across 3 provinces and into the royal council itself. Where Seraphina offered devotion, Vivian offered territory. Where Serafina offered kindness, Vivian offered leverage. The mathematics were not complicated, but mathematics never accounted for the cost. He crossed the ballroom floor. Serafina saw him coming, and her face did the thing that always made him feel like a man standing on a crack in the ice. It softened, not with performance or calculation, but with the plain, unguarded relief of someone who has been waiting and finally sees the waiting end. She smiled, and the smile said, "There you are. I knew you would come." "Cadric." She reached for his hand. Her fingers were warm. "I was beginning to think you had been captured by Lord Pemberton's hunting stories again." "Pemberton could not capture a cold," he said, and she laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from the belly and does not care who hears it. Countess Delacroix excused herself with a knowing look that Cadric ignored. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, because it was true, and because the truth was useful when you needed someone standing still. "You look like a man with something on his mind." She knew him. That was the problem. 6 years of proximity had given her a map of his silences, and she could read the terrain. He felt the familiar irritation rise in his chest, the one that whispered, "She sees too much. She will want too much. She will need you to be something you are not." "Dance with me," he said. "Now?" "Now." She took his hand and they moved onto the floor. The waltz was an old one. She followed his lead without resistance, her body aligned with his like a sentence that already knew its ending. Around them, other couples moved in their own orbits, but Cadric was aware only of the mechanics of what he was about to do, turning it over in his mind like a man inspecting a weapon before use. "Serafina." "After this dance, I need to address the gathering." She looked up. Her eyes searched his face. "An announcement?" "Of sorts." Something flickered behind her expression. Not suspicion exactly, but the shadow of suspicion. The instinct of a woman who has spent 6 years reading a man who gives nothing away and has learned to watch for the nothing. Should I be worried? He should have said yes. That was the moment. That was the crack in the wall where honesty could have slipped through and changed everything. He could have pulled her aside, taken her to the terrace, spoken to her privately like a man with even a residual shred of decency. He did not. "No," he said. "Just stay close." The waltz ended. The orchestra paused. Cadric released her hand and walked toward the center of the ballroom where a raised platform held the ceremonial toast table. He picked up a fresh glass. He signaled the master of ceremonies, who struck the floor 3 times with the silver staff. The room quieted. 400 faces turned toward the Duke of the Eastern March. Cadric looked out across the sea of silk and ambition, and for one heartbeat, one single fractured second, he felt the weight of what he was about to do press against his sternum like a hand. He registered it. He catalogued it. And then he set it aside because Cadric Blackmore had learned a long time ago that feelings were the first casualty of survival. "My lords, my ladies, your royal highnesses." He bowed toward the royal dais where King Aldrich and Queen Marguerite sat with their sons. Crown Prince Adrian Valmont, 28, watched from the second chair with an expression of polite disinterest that Cadric recognized as the mask of a man who paid attention to everything. "I thank the Crown for this evening's generosity, and I take this moment to share news that concerns my house and my future." He paused. The room leaned in. Serafina stood 15 feet away. She was smiling, still smiling. The smile of a woman who believes the next sentence will contain her name and the word she has waited 6 years to hear. "For some time," Cadric said, "it has been assumed by many that Lady Serafina Vale would one day carry the title of Duchess of Blackmore." He watched her smile begin to set, not fade, set, like cement. "I want to be clear about something." His voice did not waver. "She was never worthy of becoming a duchess." The ballroom did not gasp. That was the thing people got wrong later, when they retold the story in drawing rooms and taverns. There was no collective intake of breath, no dramatic silence. What happened was worse. What happened was a ripple, a slow creeping wave of reaction that moved from the front of the crowd to the back, each face processing the words at its own speed, each pair of eyes swiveling from Cadric to Serafina to see how the blow would land. Cadric did not look at her. He turned slightly and extended his hand toward the northern edge of the crowd, where Vivian Ashford stood in a gown of ivory and gold, her expression carefully arranged into a portrait of humble surprise that had been rehearsed 3 times in her bedroom mirror. Lady Vivian Ashford has graciously accepted my courtship. It is my honor to present her as the future Duchess of Blackmore. Applause. Thin, uncertain, but applause. Because the aristocracy was a machine that ran on protocol, and protocol demanded acknowledgement even when the gears were clogged with cruelty. Cedric finally looked at Serafina. She had not moved. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was a landscape stripped of weather. No tears, no trembling, just a stillness so total it looked like the stillness of a body after the heart has stopped and the muscles have not yet received the message. Around her the whispers began. Always knew she was reaching above her station. The Vale family, what did she expect? Poor thing, though honestly she should have seen it coming. Laughter. Scattered, wet, ugly laughter, the kind that people produce when they are grateful the humiliation belongs to someone else. Serafina's eyes met Cedric's across the ballroom. He expected to see pain. He expected tears, or fury, or the dramatic collapse that would give him the narrative he needed, the story of an emotional woman who proved herself unfit. What he saw instead was something he did not have a category for. It was not hatred. It was not heartbreak. It was recognition. The look of someone who has just discovered the answer to a question they have been asking for 6 years, and the answer is worse than they imagined, and the answer is also, somehow, a relief. She held his gaze for 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the eastern doors. Not running, not stumbling. Walking with the posture of a woman who has decided that the last dignified act available to her is the manner of her exit. Harlan appeared at Cedric's side. That was surgical, Harlan said. His voice was flat. Congratulations. You have all the warmth of a field amputation. She will be fine. You keep saying that. Because it is true. Because you need it to be true. There is a difference. Cedric drained his whiskey. The burn felt appropriate. I have secured the Ashford alliance, 3 provinces, a seat on the council within the year. This is what the house needed. And what about what she needed? She needed to understand her position. Harlan stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without another word. Cedric watched him go and felt nothing, which he interpreted as strength. It would be years before he understood it was numbness, and that numbness was just pain wearing a better suit. The rest of the evening moved the way evenings move when someone has detonated a small bomb in the center of a party. The guests danced around the crater. Vivian Ashford stood beside Cedric with the practiced poise of a woman who had been briefed on her role and understood it was transactional. She was beautiful. She was strategic. She was not warm, and Cedric told himself this was a feature, not a deficit. You handled that cleanly, she said as they walked the perimeter of the ballroom. Did you expect otherwise? I expected her to cry. She did not cry. No. That bothers you. Nothing bothers me. Vivian gave him a look that suggested she was already cataloging his weaknesses for future use. He respected that. It was exactly what he would have done. By midnight, the banquet had metabolized the scandal and moved on to its next course. Serafina's absence was noted, discussed, and dismissed with the efficiency of a society that consumed its wounded. Cedric stood on the terrace alone. The winter air cut through his coat, and he let it. Below him, the capital city of Aldenmere spread out in a grid of gaslight and shadow, its rooftops dusted with the season's first frost. Somewhere in that city, a woman was packing her belongings. He knew this the way you know things about people you have studied for 6 years. She would not scream. She would not write letters. She would disappear, because Serafina Vale had always understood, better than anyone, that the only power left to the defeated was the refusal to perform their defeat. He gripped the stone railing. A sound came from behind him. Footsteps on marble. He turned, expecting Harlan, expecting Vivian, expecting one of the dozen sycophants who would want to pledge allegiance to the winning side. Crown Prince Adrian Valmont stood in the terrace doorway. He was taller than Cedric by an inch, leaner by 20 pounds, and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who has never had to fight for his place at the table because the table was built around him. His uniform was military dress, dark green with gold braid, and he wore it like a man who actually earned it, which he had. 2 tours on the northern border, a field promotion during the Kessler engagement, the kind of credentials that made courtiers nervous because they could not be bought or inherited. "Your Grace," Kedrick said, straightening. Adrian walked to the railing and stood beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The prince looked out over the city the way a man looks at something he will one day be responsible for and is not entirely sure he wants. "That was a hell of a thing in there," Adrian said. "A necessary decision, Your Highness." Necessary. Adrian tasted the word. My father uses that word a lot. Usually when he is about to do something that requires an apology he will never give. Kedrick said nothing. "I have met Lady Seraphina twice," Adrian continued. "Once at the Harvest Assembly. Once during the flood relief in Pemberton Province. She organized medical supply chains for 3 villages in 48 hours. Did you know that?" I was aware of her charitable activities. Charitable activities? Adrian turned to look at him. The prince's eyes were dark brown, and they held a quality that Kedrick found deeply inconvenient: sincerity. She carried supplies through waist-deep water herself because the supply carts could not cross the river. She did not tell anyone she was a noblewoman. The villagers thought she was a school teacher. An admirable anecdote. "It is not an anecdote, Blackmore. It is a character reference, and you just called her worthless in front of the entire kingdom." The word landed like a slap. "I said she was not worthy of the title of Duchess," Kedrick corrected. "There is a distinction. Not to the 400 people who heard it, and not to her." Silence. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint sound of the orchestra resuming inside. "I did not come out here to lecture you," Adrian said. "Your romantic decisions are your own. But I want you to understand something, Duke Blackmore, because I think you are a man who calculates everything and understands very little." Kedrick's jaw clenched. "The measure of a man is not what he builds. It is what he destroys when it becomes inconvenient. And tonight, you destroyed something that trusted you. In public. For leverage." Adrian pushed off the railing. "Enjoy your alliance." He walked back inside without waiting for a response. Kedrick stood alone on the terrace for a long time after that. The cold settled into his bones and he let it, because the cold was honest and the ballroom behind him was not. He told himself that Adrian was young, idealistic, burdened with the luxury of principles that power had not yet corroded. He told himself that the prince did not understand the calculus of survival, the brutal arithmetic of a dukedom that was bleeding revenue and losing influence to houses with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. He told himself many things. None of them silenced the image of Seraphina's face in the moment before she turned away. That expression, that terrible quiet recognition, as if she had known all along what he was and had simply been waiting for him to prove it. By dawn, the rumors confirmed what he already knew. Lady Seraphina Vale had left the capital. Her rooms at the Vale townhouse were emptied. Her trunks were gone. No letters, no forwarding address, no dramatic farewell to feed the gossip mills. She had simply ceased to exist within the boundaries of polite society, as cleanly and completely as if she had never been there at all. The capital absorbed this information the way it absorbed everything, greedily. "She went to the countryside, I heard, some distant relative in the provinces. I heard she entered a convent. I heard she threw herself in the river." That last one circulated for 3 days before being dismissed. Seraphina Vale was too proud for the river. Everyone agreed on that. Kedrick heard the rumors and said nothing. He attended his meetings. He signed his documents. He stood beside Vivian Ashford at 2 more public engagements and watched the political machinery begin to turn in his favor. Marquis Ashford opened doors. Invitations arrived from houses that had previously ignored the Blackmore seal. The strategy was working. The mathematics were correct. And yet, 3 weeks after this banquet, Kedrick woke at 4 in the morning and could not return to sleep. He sat in his study with a glass of whiskey and stared at the chair across from his desk, the one where Seraphina used to sit during their evening conversations. She had a habit of pulling her knees up to her chest when she was thinking, which was improper, and which he had never corrected because it made her look like who she actually was instead of who she was performing. He drank the whiskey. He poured another. He opened the top drawer of his desk, where a small envelope sat untouched. Inside was a letter she had written him 2 years ago, during the fever outbreak in the eastern provinces. He had been sick, badly sick, The kind of sick where the physicians start speaking in past tense. She had ridden 3 days through frozen roads to reach him, and when the fever broke, she had left this letter on his nightstand. He had never read it. He picked it up now, turned it over, felt the weight of the paper, the faint impression of her handwriting through the envelope. He put it back in the drawer. He closed the drawer. He finished the whiskey and went back to bed and did not sleep. Weeks became months. The engagement to Vivian proceeded along its prescribed timeline. Invitations were printed. A venue was selected. The political returns continued to materialize. Kedrick sat in council meetings and watched his influence expand like a stain across a white tablecloth, and he told himself that this was what winning looked like. Then the war came. It did not arrive with trumpets or declarations. It arrived with a rider on a half-dead horse, stumbling through the northern gate of the capital at 3 a.m. with blood on his uniform and panic in his eyes. The Cathani Confederation had broken the treaty. 3 border fortresses had fallen in a single night. The northern provinces were burning. Within a week, the kingdom was mobilized. Within 2 weeks, Crown Prince Adrian Valmont had personally requested command of the Second Army and ridden north with 12,000 soldiers and the weight of a nation's survival on his shoulders. Kedrick watched the army depart from his study window. He had contributed funds, supplies, and 2 regiments of Blackmore cavalry. He had not volunteered himself. Dukes did not fight. Dukes funded. That was the arrangement. Harlan stopped by that evening. "You know she is up there," Harlan said without preamble. Kedrick did not look up from his correspondence. "Who?" "Do not do that." "I am quite busy, Harlan." "Serafina. She volunteered as a battlefield medic 3 months ago. She is attached to a field hospital near the Kessler line under a false name. A friend of mine in the medical corps recognized her." Kedrick's pen stopped. "She's working 16-hour shifts. She has pulled men out of collapsed trenches with her bare hands. She sleeps on the ground, eats soldier rations, and has not used her family name once." Harlan sat down uninvited. "The woman you said was not worthy of being a duchess is currently doing more for this kingdom than half the men in this building." "What do you want me to say?" "Nothing. I want you to sit with that information and feel whatever it is you feel. If you feel anything, which some days I genuinely doubt." Kedrick set down his pen. He looked at Harlan, and for a moment, just a moment, something moved behind the gray architecture of his eyes, something old and heavy and dangerously close to the surface. "She made her choice," Kedrick said. "I made mine." "Yes. And yours involved a ballroom and a punchline. Hers involved a battlefield and a bandage. I wonder which one history will remember more kindly." Harlan left. Kedrick sat in the gathering dark of his study and listened to the clock on the mantel tick its way through the silence. He thought about mathematics. He thought about leverage. He thought about 900-pound chandeliers that hold without trembling. Then he thought about a woman sleeping on frozen ground, wrapping wounds by lantern light, using a name that was not hers because the name that was hers had been made synonymous with humiliation. He opened the desk drawer. He took out the letter. He held it for a long time. He still did not read it, but this time, he did not put it back. 600 miles north, in a field hospital that smelled of blood and carbolic acid and the particular desperation of men who know they are dying, Serafina Vale pressed her hands against a soldier's chest and felt his heart stop beneath her palms. She did not scream. She did not cry. She noted the time, recorded his name in the casualty ledger, and moved to the next bed, where a boy of 19 was calling for his mother through a morphine haze. "I am here," she said, taking his hand. "You are not alone." She was not his mother. She was not anyone's mother. She was a disgraced noblewoman working under the name Sarah Voss, wearing a medic's apron stained with the blood of strangers, sleeping 3 hours a night on a canvas cot that smelled of mud. She had never been more herself. The field hospital was a converted barn near the village of Thornwall, 14 miles south of the active front. Every day brought new wounded. Every night brought the sound of artillery, a low, rhythmic concussion that shook the lanterns on their hooks and reminded everyone that the line between hospital and target was measured in hours, not miles. Serafina had arrived 4 months ago with nothing but a medical kit and a letter of reference forged by a sympathetic physician in the provincial capital. She told them she was a trained nurse from Aldeburgh. Nobody questioned it. In wartime, competence outranked credentials. She learned fast. She learned to tourniquet a shattered limb in under 90 seconds. She learned to recognize the smell of gangrene before the wound even showed color. She learned to hold a man's hand while the surgeon took his leg, to keep her voice steady and her eyes dry, to save the breaking for later, for the 3 a.m. darkness when she lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and let the faces come. The girl who had stood frozen in a ballroom was gone. Not killed. Shed, like a skin that no longer fit. She did not think about Kedrick. That was the lie she told herself, and she told it so often and so well that most days it was almost true. She did not think about the words. She did not think about the laughter. She did not think about the 11 words that had stripped her bare in front of everyone she had ever known. She thought about gauze. She thought about sutures. She thought about the boy in bed 14 who was going to lose his arm if the infection did not respond to treatment by morning. She thought about staying alive, one shift at a time. The night the Crown Prince was brought in, the sky was on fire. A Kathani artillery barrage had shattered the forward command post at dawn. By noon, rumors were flying through the camp like shrapnel. The prince was dead. The prince was captured. The prince was missing behind enemy lines with a skeleton guard and a gut wound. The third rumor was closest to the truth. At 9 p.m., a scout stumbled into the field hospital dragging a man through the snow. The man was barely conscious, wearing a uniform so caked in blood and mud that the insignia was invisible. He had a deep laceration across his left side, 2 cracked ribs, and the gray pallor of someone who had been bleeding for hours. "Found him in the ravine," the scout gasped. "There were Kathani patrols everywhere. His guard is dead, all of them." Serafina was the first medic to reach the table. She cut away his jacket. She packed the wound. She started a saline line with hands that did not shake, because shaking was a luxury she had trained out of herself months ago. It was not until she wiped the mud from his face that she saw who he was. Crown Prince Adrian Valmont, the future king of the realm, lying on a blood-soaked table in a barn in the middle of nowhere, with his life running out through a 6-inch gash in his side. She did not hesitate. She did not announce his identity. She turned to the surgeon, Dr. Merrick, and said 3 words. "He needs you. Now." They worked for 4 hours. Serafina held retractors, applied pressure, monitored his breathing, changed his dressings. When the surgery was over and the prince was stabilized but still critical, Merrick collapsed into a chair and said, "If he survives the night, he survives. If not, God help us all." "He will survive the night," Serafina said, "because I will not leave his side." She did not leave his side. For 72 hours, she sat beside his cot, monitoring his pulse, changing his bandages, forcing water between his cracked lips with a cloth. When the fever spiked on the second night, she packed him in snow and talked to him through the delirium, not because she believed he could hear her, but because the sound of a human voice was sometimes the thread that kept a dying man tethered to the world. On the third morning, he opened his eyes. He looked at her. He did not know who she was. He saw a woman with dark circles under her eyes, blood on her apron, her hair pulled back in a knot that had not been redone in 2 days. "Where am I?" he said. His voice was a rasp. "Thornwall Field Hospital. You are safe. My men. Gone. I am sorry." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet, but his voice was steady. "What is your name?" "Sarah. Sarah." He looked at her hands, chapped and raw, and still holding his wrist to check his pulse. "You saved my life." "The surgeon saved your life. I kept you breathing until he could." "Same thing." She did not argue. She gave him water. She checked his stitches. And when he fell asleep again, she sat in the wooden chair beside his bed and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel the full weight of exhaustion. He was moved to a secure location 3 days later, carried by loyalist soldiers under cover of darkness. But before they took him, while the stretcher bearers waited outside, Adrian Valmont reached for her hand. "Sarah, Your Highness, one day I will find you again. And whatever you need, whatever you are running from, whatever brought you to this place, I will repay it. Not because I owe you a debt, because loyalty like yours does not exist where I come from, and I never want to forget that it exists at all." She looked at him, and for one terrible second, she almost told him everything. Who she was, what she was running from, the 11 words that had driven her from the only life she had ever known into a world of mud, blood, and the anonymous mercy of strangers. She did not. "Survive the war, Your Highness," she said. "That is repayment enough." They carried him into the darkness. She stood in the doorway of the barn and watched the torchlight disappear into the tree line. Snow was falling. The artillery had gone quiet for the first time in days, and in the silence, the world felt enormous and empty and full of things she could not name. She went back inside. She washed her hands. She walked to bed 14, where the boy with the infected arm was sleeping. She sat down. She took his hand, and somewhere, 600 miles south, in a study filled with expensive whiskey and unread letters, Duke Cadric Blackmore sat alone in the dark, holding an envelope he could not bring himself to open, wondering for the first time if the weight he had spent his whole life building was not strength at all, but a cage. And the lock was on the inside. The war ended the way wars end, not with a single thunderclap, but with a slow, grinding exhaustion that left both sides too broken to keep swinging. The Cathani Confederation signed the armistice on a gray Tuesday in a farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and stale bread, and the kingdom exhaled for the first time in 14 months. The dead stayed dead. The living stumbled home. Serafina did not stumble. She walked, methodically, deliberately, the way she had done everything since the night she left the capital with an empty name and a medical kit full of someone else's credentials. She stayed at the Thornwall Field Hospital for 6 weeks after the armistice, helping process the last wave of wounded, cataloging supplies, training local women to handle basic triage. When Dr. Merrick asked her to stay permanently, she considered it. "You are the best field medic I have worked with," Merrick said, leaning against the barn door with his pipe. He looked 10 years older than he had at the start of the war. They all did. "I could use you for the reconstruction effort." "You do not need me. You need funding and clean bandages." "I need both. And I need someone who does not flinch." She almost said yes. The anonymity of Sarah Voss had become a kind of armor. And armor was hard to take off once you had learned how well it stopped the bleeding. But there was something pulling at her, not nostalgia, not revenge, something quieter and more dangerous than either. Unfinished business. She left Thornwall on a cold morning in March, riding south on a supply wagon headed for the provincial capital. She carried one bag. Inside it, 3 changes of clothing, a medical journal she had kept throughout the war, and a reputation that had spread through the Northern Army like brush fire. The medic who never left. The woman who carried wounded men through artillery barrages. The healer who sat beside the Crown Prince for 3 days and refused to let him die. She did not know that Last Story had traveled ahead of her. She did not know that Adrian Valmont had spent months quietly searching for the woman who had saved his life, working from a physical description and a first name and the particular memory of hands that did not shake. She did not know that the kingdom she was returning to had already begun to change shape around her absence. 600 miles south, the capital was preparing for the victory celebration. Cadric Blackmore stood in his dressing room and adjusted his collar for the 4th time. His valet, a patient man named Greaves who had served the Blackmore household for 22 years, watched this ritual with the carefully blank expression of someone who has learned that commenting on his employer's anxiety is a career-ending decision. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace." "I am aware. Lady Ashford's attendant sent word that she will meet you at the palace entrance." "Fine. And Lord Voss asked me to relay that he will be, and I quote, drunk by the time you arrive. So do not bother looking for him near the refreshments, because he will already be beyond them." Cadric did not smile. He had not smiled in a way that reached his eyes in months, a fact he was not aware of because self-awareness, for all his intelligence, had always been his blind architecture. He could map the political motivations of every noble house in the kingdom. He could not map the geography of his own hollowing. The engagement to Vivian had proceeded as planned. The political returns had materialized exactly as calculated. Marquis Ashford had delivered his end of the arrangement with the efficiency of a man who understood that daughters were currency and currency was meant to circulate. Cadric now sat on 2 additional council committees. His revenue streams had stabilized. The Blackmore name carried more weight than it had in a generation. And every night he sat in his study with a glass of whiskey and an unopened letter and felt the particular emptiness of a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted and discovered that wanting and needing are different animals entirely. He had read the letter. 3 weeks after Harlan told him about Serafina's presence on the front lines, Kadrick had broken the seal on the envelope she had left during his fever, 2 years before the banquet, 2 years before the 11 words, in a time when she still believed he was a man worth writing to. The letter was short, 4 lines. He had memorized them involuntarily, the way the body memorizes the location of a wound. She had written about the night she rode 3 days through frozen roads to reach him. She had written that she was not afraid of losing him to the fever. She was afraid of what it would mean if she was not there when it happened. She was afraid that the last thing he would know was an empty room. 4 lines, no declarations of love, no demands, just the raw, stripped-down terror of a woman who could not bear the thought of someone she cared about dying alone. He had folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket. He carried it there still. He did not examine why. The victory celebration was the largest event the capital had seen in a decade. The palace grounds had been transformed into a spectacle of lanterns, banners, and ceremonial arches. 10,000 citizens filled the public squares. Inside the palace, 800 invited guests occupied the grand reception hall, a space so vast that conversations on one end could not be heard on the other. Kedrick arrived with Vivian on his arm. She wore emerald silk and a necklace that cost more than most soldiers earned in a lifetime. She looked perfect. She always looked perfect. Perfection was her primary skill, and she deployed it with the precision of a marksman. "The Ashford contingent is in the East Wing," she said as they crossed the entrance hall. "My father wants to discuss the harbor tariff vote before the formal proceedings. After. He was quite specific about before, and I am quite specific about after." Her mouth tightened. 1 millimeter. The only visible sign that Vivian Ashford experienced frustration, and she experienced it frequently in Kadrick's company, because Kadrick treated their relationship the way he treated a business contract. Honored in letter, bankrupt in spirit. They had not kissed in 2 months. She had not noticed for 3 weeks. This told them both everything they needed to know, and neither acknowledged it, because acknowledgement would require a conversation about feelings. And feelings were a language neither of them spoke fluently. The grand reception hall was already thick with noise when they entered. Military officers in dress uniforms. Nobles in their finest. The royal family on the elevated dais at the far end. King Aldrich looking tired but resolute. Queen Marguerite regal and watchful. And Crown Prince Adrian standing at the edge of the platform in his military dress, scanning the crowd with an intensity that had nothing to do with protocol. He was looking for someone. Kadrick felt it before he understood it. A shift in the room's atmospheric pressure, the way you feel a storm before you see it. Conversations near the main entrance began to stutter and redirect. Heads turned. The great social organism of the aristocracy pivoted its collective attention toward the doors. Serafina Vale walked into the palace. She wore a gown the color of winter dawn, pale gray, almost silver, simple in a way that made every other woman's elaborate ensemble look like it was trying too hard. Her hair was pulled back. No jewels, no ornamentation. She carried nothing, and she needed nothing, because the woman who walked through those doors was not the woman who had walked out of them 2 years ago. That woman had been built to please. This woman had been built by war. It was in her posture, straight but not rigid. The stance of someone who has carried stretchers, who has stood for 18 hours without sitting, whose body has learned that endurance is not a performance, but a habit. Her face had thinned. Her cheekbones were sharper, and her eyes, those eyes that Kadrick remembered as warm and seeking, were quiet now, settled. The eyes of someone who has seen enough suffering to burn away everything that was not essential. She did not look for Kadrick when she entered. She did not look for anyone. She simply walked into the room as if the room owed her nothing, and she owed it even less. Kadrick's chest compressed, a physical sensation, not metaphor. The muscles around his ribcage contracted as if bracing for impact, and his fingers tightened on the glass in his hand until the crystal creaked. Vivian noticed. "What is it?" "Nothing." "You are staring." "I said nothing." She followed his gaze. She saw Serafina, and Vivian Ashford, who calculated human interactions the way an engineer calculated load-bearing tolerances, understood immediately. "Ah," she said. That single syllable contained an entire engineering report on the structural integrity of her engagement. Across the hall, Adrian Valmont had stopped breathing. He stood on the edge of the royal dais, one hand resting on the ceremonial railing, and watched Serafina cross the floor. Recognition hit him like a physical force. He had spent months searching. He had sent discreet inquiries through military channels, contacted every field hospital in the Northern Theater, described a woman named Sarah with steady hands and dark circles under her eyes and a voice that could hold a dying man to the world. And here she was, walking into his palace as if she had simply been away and had now returned, the way the tide returns, without apology and without announcement. He descended the dais steps. His personal guard moved to follow, and he waved them back with a gesture that said, "Not now," and meant, "Not ever," for this. The crowd noticed the Crown Prince moving through the hall with purpose. Conversations died in his wake, like candles in a draught. By the time he reached the center of the reception floor, the silence had spread outward in a widening circle until nearly half the room was watching. Serafina saw him coming. She stopped. Her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. The same way you recognize a face from a fever dream, half real and half impossible. "Sarah," he said. The name hung in the air. His voice carried across the silence, and every noble in earshot heard it, heard the weight and the warmth and the particular reverence of a man addressing someone who had become, without either of them planning it, the most important person in his memory. "Your Highness," she said, "I looked for you. I was not hiding. You were not easy to find either." The ghost of a smile. The first one she had allowed herself in months. It did not last, but it existed, and Adrian saw it, and something in his posture relaxed, as if a question he had been carrying for a very long time had just received the beginning of an answer. He turned to face the crowd. The full weight of the Crown Prince's authority settled onto his shoulders like a mantle, and when he spoke, his voice filled the hall the way a bell fills a cathedral. "Before this celebration begins, I owe a debt that no title and no treasury can repay." The room went still. "During the Battle of Thornwall, I was gravely wounded behind enemy lines. My guard was killed. I was carried to safety and kept alive for 3 days by a woman who asked nothing in return and gave everything she had." He turned to Serafina. His eyes were steady. "That woman is Lady Serafina Vale, and she is the reason the Crown Prince of this kingdom is standing here tonight." The silence that followed was not the silence of the winter banquet. That silence had been cruel, voyeuristic, hungry for blood. This silence was something else entirely. This silence was the sound of 400 people recalculating everything they thought they knew. Then King Aldrich rose from his throne. The monarch had not stood voluntarily at a public event in 3 years. His health was declining, his joints were failing, and the simple act of rising required a will that bordered on defiance. But he rose, slowly, completely, and when the king stands, the kingdom stands with him. 800 guests rose to their feet. Queen Marguerite placed her hand over her heart. The generals in the front row, men who had commanded the armies that won the war, men whose chests were heavy with medals, bowed their heads. For Serafina. Cedric watched this happen. He stood near the western colonnade, exactly where he had stood 2 years ago on the night he destroyed her, and he watched the entire kingdom rise for the woman he had called unworthy. His body processed the moment before his mind did. His vision narrowed. His pulse dropped. His skin went cold the way skin goes cold before the body commits to either fighting or running. The glass in his hand was shaking. He set it down before anyone could see. Vivienne was watching him. She did not touch his arm. She did not speak. She simply watched with the detached interest of someone observing a bridge collapse from a safe distance. "Well," she said finally, "that is inconvenient." Harlan materialized at Cedric's other side. "Do not say it," Cedric said. "I was not going to say anything. You were going to say you told me so. I was going to say that you look like a man who just realized the most expensive mistake of his life is standing 30 feet away being honored by the king. But sure, I told you so also works." Cedric said nothing. His jaw was locked so tight the tendons in his neck stood out like cables. He watched Adrian take Serafina's hand and lead her toward the royal dais, where the king waited to thank her personally. He watched the crowd part for her the way crowds part for someone they are afraid of, or someone they revere. And he understood with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass that the distance between those two things was measured in choices. His choices. The celebration continued. Music began. Guests drank and danced and retold the story of the Crown Prince, and the mysterious medic to each other in increasingly embellished versions. Serafina was surrounded by well-wishers, military officers who wanted to shake the hand of the woman who had saved their prince, noble women who wanted to stand close enough to her to borrow her sudden relevance by proximity. Through it all, she was gracious, calm, present but unreachable. The warmth she had once offered freely had been replaced by something harder and more deliberate. She smiled when smiled at. She accepted compliments without deflecting and without preening. She moved through the crowd the way a soldier moves through hostile territory, aware of every angle, committed to none. Kadric waited 2 hours before approaching her. He found her on the eastern terrace, standing alone for the first time all evening. She was looking out over the palace gardens, where lanterns floated on the reflecting pool like fallen stars. The noise of the celebration was muffled by the glass doors behind her. Serafina! She did not turn immediately. She heard his voice, and something moved across her shoulders, a tension, a tightening, the body's memory of a wound registering the proximity of the blade that made it. Then the tension released, deliberately, like a breath forced out. She turned. Duke Blackmore. Not Kadric. Duke Blackmore. The formality was a wall, and she laid each brick with precision. "You look well," he said. "I am well. I heard about your work in the north, the field hospitals, what you did for the wounded. Many people did similar work. Many people did not save the crown prince. No, that was luck and proximity. I happened to be standing in the right place. You have always diminished your own contributions, and you have always overvalued your own. We are consistent, at least." The words landed clean. No venom, no trembling. Just the flat surgical precision of a woman who had spent 2 years cutting away dead tissue and knew exactly where to place the blade. Kadric absorbed the hit. He stepped closer. His instinct, the deep reptilian wiring that had governed his entire adult life, was to assert, to control the frame, to find the leverage point and press until the conversation tilted in his direction. He felt that instinct surge, and for the first time in his life, he fought it. Not because he had suddenly developed a conscience, because he looked at her face and understood, with the brutal clarity of a man confronting his own reflection in unflattering light, that the old tools would not work on this woman. She was not the woman he had left. The woman he had left could be steered by expectation and doubt. This woman had been through fire, literal fire. You cannot steer someone who has already survived the worst thing you can do to them. "I owe you an apology," he said. "No. Serafina, you do not owe me an apology, Kadric. An apology implies you did not know what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were doing. You calculated it. You rehearsed it. You chose the venue, the timing, and the words to maximize the damage because maximum damage gave you maximum leverage with Ashford. It was not a mistake. It was a strategy. And strategies do not get apologies. They get consequences." Silence. The lanterns on the reflecting pool drifted in the night breeze. Somewhere inside, the orchestra was playing something slow and elegant and entirely wrong for the violence of this conversation. "You are right," Kadric said. She blinked. Of all the responses she had prepared for, agreement was not among them. "I calculated it," he continued, "every piece of it. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself you would recover. I told myself that what I was building was more important than what I was destroying. And I was wrong, not about the strategy. The strategy worked. I was wrong about what was worth building." He was breathing harder than he wanted to be. The machinery in his chest, the same machinery that had carried him through business deals and political negotiations and the cold execution of the winter banquet, was misfiring. Gears catching on something they were not designed to encounter. "The Ashford Alliance gave me everything I asked for," he said. "Council seats, revenue, influence. And I have never been more empty in my life. I sit in rooms full of powerful men and I feel nothing. I close deals that would have thrilled me 5 years ago, and they taste like ash. And every night I go back to my study and I sit in the dark, and I think about you standing in a field hospital covered in blood, doing more for this kingdom with your bare hands than I have done with all my money and all my leverage and all my perfect calculations." Serafina watched him. Her expression did not soften. It did not harden. It simply remained what it was, the steady, level gaze of a woman who has learned to assess damage. "What do you want from me, Kadric?" I do not know. That is the first honest thing you have said to me in 6 years. He almost laughed. A broken, ugly sound caught in his throat and strangled before it could escape. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she had seen only once before during his fever, when the defenses were down and the architecture was exposed. I read your letter, he said. She went still. The one you left during the fever, 4 lines. You wrote that you were not afraid of losing me. You were afraid of what it would mean if you were not there. I remember what I wrote. I carried it with me for a year before I opened it, and I have carried it every day since. That is your burden, not mine. I know. They stood in the cold, 2 people separated by 3 feet of terrace stone and 2 years of wreckage. Inside, the celebration churned on, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses raised to victory. Out here, there was only the sound of water and the distant hum of a city that did not care about the private disasters of its aristocracy. I am not asking you to forgive me, Kedrick said. Good, because I will not. I am asking you to believe that I understand what I did. Understanding does not undo damage. You taught me that. She turned back to the garden. Her profile in the lantern light was sharp, clean, stripped of everything unnecessary. He looked at her and saw a woman who had built herself from scratch in a place where titles meant nothing and blood on your hands was literal, and he understood that the girl he had broken was not coming back, not because she had been destroyed, because she had been replaced by something stronger, something he had no claim to and no right to reach for. Goodbye, Kedrick. She walked back inside without looking at him. He stood on the terrace alone. The cold seeped through his coat. Below him, the reflecting pool held the lanterns in its dark mirror, and he thought about weight. 900 pounds of chandelier. The weight of a dukedom. The weight of a letter in his breast pocket that weighed nothing at all and crushed him completely. Then another voice came from the doorway. Duke Blackmore. Adrian Valmont stood at the threshold. He was not smiling. His uniform was immaculate, and his posture was the posture of a man who has moved past courtesy into something more territorial. Your Highness? I saw you speaking with Lady Seraphina. A private conversation. Nothing is private in a palace. You should know that better than anyone. Kedrick met his gaze. 2 men. One who had destroyed something precious out of calculation. One who had been saved by it. They stood on opposite sides of a doorway that was also a border, and both of them knew it. She deserves to be left alone, Adrian said. With respect, Your Highness, that is her decision, not yours. You are right. It is her decision. And she made it 2 years ago when she walked out of your ballroom and chose a battlefield over your company. That should tell you everything you need to know. Kedrick felt the hit land in his sternum, clean, precise, the kind of blow that does not bruise on the outside. I am not asking for your permission, Kedrick said, and I am not giving it. I am telling you what I observed. You had something extraordinary, and you broke it in public for a political alliance that will expire when the next election cycle shifts the council. Vivian Ashford is already positioning herself for an exit. Her father has been in talks with the Remington family for 3 weeks. You know this. I know you know this because you are not stupid. You are something worse than stupid. You are brilliant and cruel, and that combination destroys everything it touches. The words hit like artillery. Kedrick stood motionless. His face betrayed nothing. His pulse was doing something his body did not approve of. Stay away from her, Adrian said. Not because I am commanding you, because you owe her at least that much. He turned and walked back inside. Kedrick stood on the terrace for a long time. The lanterns on the reflecting pool had begun to go out, one by one, their small flames surrendering to the water that carried them. He watched each one die and thought about Harlan's voice saying, "People are not chess pieces." He thought about Dr. Merrick in a barn saying, "If he survives the night." He thought about Seraphina's face in the ballroom 2 years ago, that recognition, that terrible, quiet knowing. He thought about Adrian's words, brilliant and cruel. And for the first time in his life, Kedrick Blackmore did not have a strategy. He did not have a calculation. He did not have a next move. He had only the growing, suffocating certainty that every door he had opened with leverage was now closing under its own weight, and the one door he needed had been locked from the other side by a woman who no longer carried the key because she had thrown it into the snow outside a field hospital and walked away without looking back. Inside the palace, Vivian Ashford was already speaking with her father, in low tones near the east wing. Her face was composed. Her hands were still. She was rearranging the architecture of her future with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and the name Blackmore was being quietly removed from the blueprints. Inside the grand halls, Serafina stood near the reflecting windows and accepted a glass of wine from a general who had fought at Thornwall and remembered the medic who never left. She smiled at him. She drank. She looked out at the garden and did not look at the terrace. And inside the private quarters of the palace, Crown Prince Adrian Valmont sat at his writing desk and opened a leather journal. He wrote one line. I found her. He closed the journal. He placed his hand flat on the cover, and he sat in the quiet of his room and listened to the celebration below and thought about a woman in a barn who had held his wrist in the dark and said, "You are not alone." On the terrace, the last lantern went out. Kedrick reached into his breast pocket. He took out the letter. He unfolded it. He read the 4 lines one more time, the handwriting blurring slightly because his eyes were doing something they had not done since he was 11 years old, and he folded it again and placed it back against his chest. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Not Adrian, not Harlan, not Serafina, not... Marquis Ashford stepped onto the terrace. His face was pleasant in the way that knives are pleasant when they are still in the sheath. Duke Blackmore. A word. Marquis. My daughter informs me that circumstances have evolved. I am inclined to agree. Kedrick looked at him. The political machinery inside his skull attempted to engage, and for the first time in his adult life, it stuttered. She also informs me that the terms of our arrangement no longer serve her interests, or mine. What are you saying? I am saying, Duke Blackmore, that alliances built on the humiliation of inconvenient women tend to attract partners who will do the same to you when you become inconvenient. He smiled, thin, professional, final. Consider this conversation a courtesy. He walked back inside. Kedrick stood alone on the empty terrace of the palace, where he had once been one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and the cold wrapped around him like a debt collector, patient and absolute, and the city below continued to celebrate a victory that had nothing to do with him. And the woman he had broken was somewhere inside those walls being honored by the man who would one day be king, and every single piece of the architecture he had spent his life constructing was cracking along fault lines. He had laid himself with his own hands on a winter night when he chose leverage over a woman who rode 3 days through frozen roads because she could not bear the thought of him dying alone. There was no going back from this terrace. There had never been a way back, only forward, into a future he could no longer calculate, no longer control, and no longer recognize as his own. The Ashford withdrawal hit like a blade between the ribs 3 days after the victory celebration. Not a public announcement. Marquis Ashford was far too sophisticated for that. He operated the way ice operates on stone, slow pressure in the cracks until the structure splits from within. The first sign was a letter delivered to Kedrick's study by private courier at 6 in the morning. Cream paper. The Ashford seal in burgundy wax. 3 paragraphs of immaculate diplomatic language that said, in essence, we are done with you. Vivian's engagement ring was returned in a velvet box inside the same envelope. Kedrick read the letter twice. He set it down. He picked up the ring box and opened it. The diamond caught the early light and threw a small rainbow across the ceiling of his study, and he stared at that rainbow for a long time, because it was easier to look at refracted light than to look at the thing that was beginning to collapse inside his chest. He closed the box. He placed it in the top drawer of his desk, next to Serafina's letter, and the 2 objects sat side by side in the dark like artifacts from 2 different civilizations that had both failed. By noon, the political consequences had begun to metastasize. Lord Aldworth, who had aligned his trade votes with Kedrick for 3 consecutive sessions on the strength of the Ashford connection, sent a terse note declining their scheduled meeting. Countess Harrington, whose support on the harbor tariff had been contingent on Marquis Ashford's endorsement, stopped returning messages entirely. Sir Edwin Crane, the parliamentary liaison Kedrick had cultivated for 18 months, was suddenly unavailable for the foreseeable future. One by one, the pillars were pulling out. Kedrick sat in his study and watched the architecture of his influence disassemble itself with the mechanical precision of a clock running backward. Each defection was logical. Each abandonment was rational. These were not acts of malice. They were acts of mathematics, the same mathematics he had always championed, The same cold calculus he had applied to every relationship, every alliance, every human connection that crossed his path. The machine was doing exactly what he had designed it to do. It was optimizing, and he was no longer the optimal choice. Harlan arrived at 3 in the afternoon, uninvited and unannounced, carrying a bottle of whiskey and the expression of a man attending a funeral he had predicted. "So," Harlan said, settling into the chair across from Kadrick's desk. "How many?" "How many what?" "How many have pulled out since this morning?" Kadrick did not answer immediately. He was looking at the stack of correspondence on his desk, each letter a small severance, each polite declination a brick removed from the wall. 7. Harlan whistled low. 7 by 3 o'clock. That is efficient. I will give them that. This is not amusing. No, it is not. But it is predictable. You built a coalition on a marriage alliance. The marriage alliance collapsed, and now the coalition is following it down. This is how transactional politics works. You wrote the textbook, Kadrick. You do not get to complain when other people read it. Kadrick's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. The leather creaked under his grip. Ashford is not just withdrawing, he said. He is repositioning against me. Ah. He has been in talks with the Remington family. Adrian told me that on the terrace, and I was too busy drowning in my own wreckage to process the implications. Ashford is building a new block. Remington controls the Southern grain monopoly. Combined with Ashford's harbor interests, they will have enough leverage to challenge my seat on the Trade Council within 6 months. And your response? I do not have one. Harlan set down his glass. This was, in 22 years of friendship, the first time he had heard Kadrick Blackmore admit to strategic paralysis. You need allies, Harlan said carefully. I am aware. Real ones. Not the transactional kind. People who will stand with you because they believe in something, not because you are holding a contract over their heads. And where exactly do I find those, Harlan? I have spent my entire career ensuring that every relationship I have is based on leverage. I did that deliberately. I did that because leverage is reliable and loyalty is not. And now I am sitting in a room full of levers that all point at someone else. The words came out harder than he intended. Raw. The veneer was cracking, and underneath it was something Kadrick had not shown another human being in years. Not vulnerability exactly, something more corrosive. The recognition that the system he had built, the philosophy he had lived by, the entire framework of transactional power that had defined his adult life was not just failing, it was working perfectly, and it was destroying him. Because transactions end. That was their nature. They completed and they closed, and the parties walked away and found better terms elsewhere. He had built his life on a mechanism designed to be temporary, and now the temporary was arriving, and he had nothing permanent underneath. Harlan watched him. For once, the older man did not reach for humor. There is something else, Harlan said. Something you need to hear, and you are not going to like it. When have I ever liked anything you tell me? Lord Pemberton hosted a dinner last night, private, 12 guests. I was not invited, but Caldwell was, and Caldwell talks when he drinks. Get to it. Ashford made a toast. He told the table that the Blackmore dukedom was, and I am quoting Caldwell's drunken recollection here, a house built on borrowed furniture. He said that your family's holdings in the Eastern March have been leveraged beyond their actual value for years, that the revenue figures you have been presenting to the council are inflated by temporary trade concessions that expire next quarter, and that once those concessions lapse, the Blackmore estate will be operating at a deficit. Kadrick went very still. Is it true? Harlan asked. The silence lasted 8 seconds. In that silence, Kadrick's face did something it almost never did. It showed the scaffolding. The effort of maintaining composure became visible, a flicker in the jaw, a tightening around the eyes, the minute dilation of pupils that accompanies the body's recognition that it has been cornered. The concessions expire in 11 weeks, Kadrick said. So it is true. The revenue projections were based on renewal assumptions. The concessions have been renewed automatically for 6 years. There was no reason to believe they would not be renewed again, except that the renewal requires council approval, and the council members who would have approved it are the same ones who just stopped returning your letters. Kadrick stood. The motion was abrupt, almost violent. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the rooftops and the chimney smoke, and the anonymous thousands who had no idea that the Duke of the Eastern March was standing in his study, watching his empire come apart at the seams. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Gray eyes. Hard jaw. The face of a man who had spent 31 years building a fortress and had just discovered that the foundation was sand. "How did Ashford get the financial information?" Kedrick asked. His voice was quiet now, controlled in the way that a man's voice is controlled when the alternative is screaming. Harlan hesitated. "Harlan?" "Greaves." The name landed like a gunshot in an empty room. "What?" Caldwell said that Ashford's source was someone inside the Blackmore household, someone with access to private financial documents and correspondence. The description matches Greaves. Greaves. 22 years. The man who laid out his clothes. The man who managed his household staff. The man who stood in the hallway outside his study every evening and asked if His Grace required anything further and called him Sir, with a deference that Kedrick had never questioned because it had never occurred to him that deference could be a performance. Kedrick's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the windowsill and held them there, willing the tremor to stop, willing the machinery to re-engage, willing the cold precision that had governed his entire life to come back online and process this information the way it processed everything else, as data, as variables, as problems to be solved. The machinery did not respond. What responded instead was something older and more primitive, something from the basement of his psychology that he had spent decades burying under strategy and calculation, and the comfortable fiction that human beings were systems that could be managed. Rage. Not the clean surgical anger he had used as a tool his whole life. This was the other kind. The hot, wet animal fury that comes from being gutted by someone who shared your roof and ate your food and stood 3 feet away while you slept. "How long?" Kedrick said. "I do not know." Caldwell was not specific. "How long, Harlan?" "My guess? Months. At least since the engagement, possibly longer. Ashford would have wanted someone inside your operation from the beginning. Insurance, in case the alliance went south. So the entire time I was performing this arrangement, securing this alliance, humiliating the woman who actually gave a damn about me, Ashford had a man inside my house feeding him everything. My finances, my correspondence, my vulnerabilities." "Yes." Kedrick turned from the window. His face had changed. The composure was gone, but what replaced it was not the theatrical fury of a man who wants to be seen being angry. It was quieter than that, colder. The look of someone who has just watched the last illusion burn away and is standing in the ash trying to decide what to do with the rest of his life. "Get Greaves." "Kedrick." "Get him now." Harlan left. Kedrick stood alone in his study and breathed. In, out. The air tasted like dust and old whiskey and the particular staleness of a room where too many lies had been told. He looked at the desk, the correspondence, the ring box in the drawer, Seraphina's letter beside it. 2 objects in the dark, one representing everything he had chased and the other representing everything he had thrown away. And between them, the negative space of a man who had confused acquisition with achievement and was now discovering the difference at the worst possible moment. Greaves entered the study 7 minutes later. He was composed, immaculate. His posture carried the practiced neutrality of a man who has been lying professionally for long enough to forget what honesty feels like. He stood in front of the desk with his hands clasped behind his back and waited. Kedrick looked at him. 22 years. This man had been present for every significant moment of his adult life. He had served wine at Kedrick's father's funeral. He had packed trunks for every political journey. He had stood outside the door the night Seraphina rode 3 days through the cold to reach Kedrick during the fever. And he had brought her tea in the morning without being asked. "Sit down," Kedrick said. "I prefer to stand, Your Grace." "I said sit down." Greaves sat. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear, calculation. The rapid assessment of a man trying to determine how much is known and how much is guessed. "How much did Ashford pay you?" The directness landed. Greaves blinked once, twice. His mouth opened and then closed, and the mask slipped for 1 fractional second, revealing underneath it the face of a man who is not sorry, but is very, very aware that he has been caught. "Your Grace, I do not know what you are referring to." Greaves, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to understand something before you answer. I am not angry. Anger implies surprise. I am not surprised. I am a man who built his entire life on the principle that everyone has a price and loyalty is a fiction, and you have just proven me right in the most personal way possible. So I am not going to shout. I'm not going to threaten. I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to answer it honestly, because the only thing you have left to sell me is the truth. How much? Greaves looked at him. The mask did not return. What replaced it was something more human and therefore more terrible. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a betrayal like a stone in his chest and is almost relieved to set it down. 400 sovereigns, paid quarterly. Since when? Since the engagement announcement. 14 months. What did you give him? Financial records, correspondence copies, staff schedules, and the private letters from your top drawer. Kedrick's breath stopped. Which letters? All of them, Your Grace. All of them, including Seraphina's. The 4 lines she had written during his fever, the most private, most unguarded thing anyone had ever given him, and Ashford had read it, had held it in his manicured hands and assessed its strategic value, and filed it away in whatever dossier he was building on the man whose daughter he was selling. Kedrick sat down, not because he chose to, because his legs made the decision for him. The strength went out of his knees the way water goes out of a cracked vessel, suddenly and completely, and he sat in his chair and looked at the man who had betrayed him and felt something he had no practice feeling. Helplessness. Not the strategic helplessness he had manufactured at negotiation tables, the calculated display of weakness designed to lure opponents into overreach. Real helplessness, the kind that comes from realizing that the walls you built to keep the world out were actually keeping you in, and the man who held the keys was selling copies to your enemies. Why? Kedrick said. The word came out smaller than he intended. Greaves looked at his hands. Because you paid me a salary, Your Grace. You did not pay me respect. In 22 years, you have never once asked me a personal question. You do not know if I have children. You do not know where I am from. You do not know my first name. I am furniture to you, and furniture does not feel guilty about being sold. The room was silent for a long time after that. Kedrick stared at Greaves. Greaves stared at his hands. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a carriage passed on the cobblestones, its wheels making the sound of something grinding away. Your first name is Edmund, Kedrick said quietly. You are from Whitmore Parish. You have 1 daughter. She married a merchant's son 3 years ago. You did not attend the wedding because I required you at the Kessler Trade Summit. Greaves looked up. I knew, Kedrick said. I knew all of it. I simply never said it because saying it would have made you a person instead of a function. And I needed functions. I needed levers and tools and mechanisms that operated without the inconvenience of being human. He stood. He walked to the window again. His reflection was still there, but it looked different now. Older, thinner, stripped of something that had once passed for strength but was actually just armor. And without the armor, the man underneath was someone he barely recognized. Leave, he said. Take what you are owed in salary. Do not take anything else, and do not come back. Greaves stood, he walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. For what it is worth, Your Grace, the lady's letter, the one she wrote during the fever. Kedrick did not turn. Ashford read it at the dinner, out loud, to 12 guests. He called it proof that you were, his words, a man who discards devotion the way lesser men discard trash. The door closed. Kedrick stood at the window. The city stretched out before him. Rooftops, chimneys. The distant spires of the palace, where a woman he had publicly destroyed was being courted by the future king. His financial position was compromised. His political alliances were dissolving. His most private correspondence had been read aloud at a dinner party as entertainment. His household had been infiltrated. His reputation was being dismantled by the same transactional machinery he had spent his career perfecting. And somewhere in the wreckage of all that calculation, buried under the rubble of every strategy that had worked exactly as designed and destroyed him exactly as it should have, there was a question. Not a strategic question, not a political question. A human question, the kind he had spent his entire adult life avoiding, because human questions do not have optimal solutions. Who am I without the armor? He did not know. That was the truth of it. Strip away the title, strip away the leverage, strip away the alliances and the revenue and the council seats and the cold machinery of transactional power, strip away the chandelier that holds 900 pounds without trembling. What is left? A man in an empty room holding a letter he should have read years ago, surrounded by the consequences of treating every person in his life as a variable in an equation that was always solving for the wrong thing. Harlan appeared in the doorway. He took one look at Kedrick's face, and the joke he had prepared died on his lips. What happened? Everything. Kedrick picked up the stack of correspondence from his desk, the letters of withdrawal, the severed alliances, the polite dismantlings. He held them in his hands and felt their weight, which was nothing, which was everything. Ashford has my financial records. He has my private letters. He read Serafina's letter at a dinner party in front of 12 witnesses. Harlan's face went white. He what? The concessions expire in 11 weeks. Without council renewal, the Blackmore estate enters a deficit. Without the Ashford block, I do not have the votes. Without the votes, I lose the trade council seat. Without the seat, I lose what is left of my political leverage. And without leverage, I am not a duke, Harlan. I am a man with a title and a house he cannot afford to heat. What are you going to do? Kedrick looked at him. And for the first time in 22 years of friendship, Harlan saw the man underneath. Not the strategist, not the duke, not the 900-pound chandelier that held without trembling. Just a man, cracked open, bleeding from places he did not know he had, standing in the rubble of everything he had built, and realizing that the rubble was all he had ever been building. I'm going to do the one thing I have never done in my life, Kedrick said, which is... He looked down at the letter in his breast pocket. 4 lines, written by a woman who rode through frozen roads because she could not bear the thought of him dying alone. A woman he had repaid with 11 words and a ballroom full of laughter. I'm going to stop calculating. He said it the way a man says, I'm going to jump, standing on the edge of something very high and very final, knowing that the fall will either kill him or teach him to fly, and not knowing which, and choosing to fall anyway because staying on the ledge had become its own kind of death. Outside, the sun was setting over Alden Mere. The city was turning gold and then copper, and then the deep, bruised violet of early evening. Somewhere in that city, alliances were being redrawn. Somewhere, Ashford was sharpening his next move. Somewhere, Vivian was signing documents. Somewhere, Adrian was writing in his journal. Somewhere, Serafina was standing in a room, not thinking about the man who had broken her, because she had already completed the work of surviving him. And in a study that smelled of old whiskey and new wreckage, Duke Kedrick Blackmore, the man who had built an empire on the principle that human beings were mechanisms to be managed, began the slow and terrifying work of dismantling the only thing he had left. He started with the debts, not the financial ones. Those were arithmetic. Those could wait. He started with the human ones because human debts were the kind that compounded in the dark, and his had been compounding for years. The first letter he wrote was to Edmund Greaves. He sat at his desk at 4 a.m, the study lit by a single lamp, and he wrote a letter to the man who had betrayed him. Not a letter of accusation, not a demand for restitution. A letter that said, simply, that he understood why Greaves had done it, that 22 years of being treated as furniture was its own kind of violence, and that the betrayal, while devastating, was earned. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer absolution. He simply acknowledged the damage and signed his name. He sealed it. He set it aside. His hand was steady, but his chest was not. The second letter was harder. He wrote to every member of his household staff, 16 people in total, and offered them 3 months of severance and a personal reference. Not because he was dismissing them, because the estate's financial position meant he could not guarantee their salaries beyond the quarter, and they deserved to know that before the creditors did. The third letter was to Harlan. It contained one line. You were right about everything. I am sorry it took me this long to hear it. He did not write to Serafina. He had no right to write to Serafina. That was the one truth he held without flinching. Whatever he was building from the wreckage of himself, it could not begin with another demand on her attention. She had given enough. He had taken enough. The ledger was closed. By dawn, The desk was covered in sealed envelopes, and the man sitting behind it was someone Kedrick Blackmore would not have recognized 6 months ago. Not softer, not gentler. Those words implied a diminishment, and what was happening was not diminishment. It was demolition. Controlled, deliberate, terrifying demolition. The tearing down of load-bearing walls with no blueprint for what comes after. He bathed. He dressed. He skipped the cufflinks because vanity suddenly felt like a language he no longer spoke. He put on a plain dark coat, the kind a merchant might wear, and he walked out of the Blackmore townhouse into the gray morning streets of Aldenmere for the first time in years without a carriage, without an escort, without the elaborate scaffolding of status that had always separated him from the city he lived in. The cobblestones were wet. The air smelled of bread from the bakeries on Linden Street and horse manure from the market district and the faintly metallic tang of river water carried on the wind. He walked through neighborhoods he had only ever seen from a carriage window. He passed laborers heading to the docks. He passed a woman selling apples from a handcart, her fingers red with cold. He passed a group of soldiers, recently discharged, sitting on the steps of a veterans' hall with the vacant stares of men whose bodies had come home, but whose minds were still in the trenches. He stopped. The Veterans Hall was a squat stone building near the river, underfunded and overcrowded. A hand-painted sign above the door read, Thornwall Veterans Relief. Underneath, in smaller letters, founded by Lady S. Vale. Kedrick stood on the sidewalk and stared at that sign until a passing cart splashed muddy water on his boots, and he did not notice. She had built this. While he was counting council votes and measuring the dimensions of his shrinking empire, she had come back to the capital and built a place for the men she had bled beside. No announcement, no society gala, no strategic deployment of charity for political leverage, just a building and a purpose, and the quiet, relentless stubbornness of a woman who fixed things because fixing things was who she was. He walked inside. The hall was crowded. 30, maybe 40 men in various states of recovery. Some missing limbs. Some missing the part of themselves that knew how to sleep without screaming. A few volunteers moved among them, distributing bread and coffee. The smell was sweat and antiseptic, and the particular funk of wool that has been worn too long. A young woman at the entrance desk looked up at him. "Can I help you, sir?" "I would like to make a donation." "That is very generous. How much?" Kedrick reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather wallet and removed every note inside it. He counted it. 1,200 sovereigns. Walking money for a duke. Operational funding for a place like this. All of it. The woman stared at the money. She stared at him. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "May I have your name for the record?" "No." He set the money on the desk and walked out. The morning air hit his face, and he breathed it in and felt something shift in the architecture of his chest. Not a healing, but a clearing, the way a demolition site feels after the dust settles and you can finally see the ground. The next 6 weeks were the hardest of his life. Kedrick Blackmore, who had spent his entire career operating from a position of strength, learned what it meant to operate from a position of nothing. The trade concessions expired. The revenue dropped. The council seat was challenged. Ashford's new bloc, strengthened by the Remington Alliance, moved against him with the coordinated precision of a military campaign, and Kedrick had no army. He sold the townhouse art collection. He dismissed the carriage service. He closed the east wing of the estate to reduce heating costs. He sat in meetings with creditors and spoke plainly about the numbers, without embellishment, without the elaborate financial theater he had once used to make weakness look like strategy. The creditors were confused by his honesty. They were accustomed to being managed. Being told the truth made them uncomfortable in a way that made Kedrick realize how deeply he had contaminated every relationship in his life with performance. Harlan stayed. Of course Harlan stayed. Harlan had been staying for 22 years through arrogance and cruelty and the particular loneliness of loving a friend who treated friendship as a utility. He showed up every afternoon with whiskey and unsolicited opinions, and Kedrick, for the first time, actually listened. "You know what your problem is?" Harlan said one evening, sprawled in the chair across from Kedrick's desk, which was now significantly less impressive due to the absence of most of the furniture that had surrounded it. "I imagine you are about to tell me. Your problem is that you spent 31 years building a machine. A perfect, efficient, ruthless machine for acquiring power. And the machine works. It works beautifully. The only flaw is that a machine does not know the difference between fuel and the people you throw into the furnace to keep it running. Kedrick looked at him. Serafina was fuel. Greaves was fuel. I was fuel. The only reason I survived is that I am too stubborn and too drunk to burn properly. That is not entirely accurate. Which part? You were never fuel, Harlan. You were the only person I did not try to use. And I did not try to use you because I could not figure out what you were useful for. Harlan laughed so hard he spilled his whiskey. It was during the 7th week that the Cathani crisis resurfaced. The armistice had held, but the northern border remained volatile. Cathani insurgent cells had been conducting raids on supply lines, targeting the reconstruction convoys that were rebuilding the devastated provinces. The military response was stretched thin. Crown Prince Adrian had been arguing for a reinforced garrison, but the council, distracted by its internal power struggles, had been delaying the vote. Then the insurgents hit Thornwall, the same village where Serafina had spent a year saving lives, the same field hospital where she had held the Crown Prince together with gauze and willpower. The Cathani raided the reconstruction depot, burned the supply warehouses, and took 14 hostages, including 3 aid workers and 2 military officers. The news reached the capital at midnight. By morning, the palace was in crisis mode. Kedrick heard about it from Harlan, who heard about it from a military contact, who heard about it from a dispatch rider who arrived at the garrison with blood on his uniform and terror in his eyes. "Thornwall," Harlan said, standing in Kedrick's doorway. His face was gray. Kedrick stood up from his desk. "Hostages? 14. The insurgents are demanding a prisoner exchange. 3 Cathani commanders held in the capital stockade for 200 civilians captured during the war. Adrian is pushing for a military response, but the council is stalling because half of them are terrified of reigniting the full conflict." "What about the garrison?" "Undermanned. The reinforcement vote has been stuck in committee for 3 weeks because Ashford's bloc keeps tabling it. They're using the garrison funding as leverage for their harbor tariff package." Kedrick felt something ignite in his chest. Not the old fire. Not the cold, calculated fury of a man protecting his interests. Something different. Hotter. More dangerous. The kind of anger that comes from watching people you have never met suffer because men in expensive rooms are playing games with their lives. He had played those games. He had been one of those men. He knew exactly how the calculus worked. Delay the vote, extract concessions, trade human lives for political advantage. It was elegant. It was efficient. It was the same machinery he had operated for years, and it was going to get 14 people killed. "Where's Adrian now?" Kedrick asked. "The palace. Emergency council session. He has been arguing for 2 hours, but Ashford and Remington are blocking every proposal." Kedrick grabbed his coat. "Where are you going?" "The palace." "You do not have a council seat anymore, Kedrick. They revoked your trade council position last week." "I am not going as a councilman." "Then what are you going as?" Kedrick stopped at the door. He looked at Harlan, and on his face was an expression that Harlan had never seen before, not in 22 years. It was not the mask of the strategist. It was not the armor of the Duke. It was the raw, unprotected face of a man who has lost everything he thought he wanted and has finally, at the bottom of his own wreckage, found the thing he is willing to fight for. "I am going as someone who owes a debt." The emergency council session was held in the war room of the royal palace, a vaulted chamber lined with maps and the accumulated dust of centuries of military deliberation. 12 council members sat around the long oak table. Marquis Ashford occupied the head of the civilian delegation, his posture relaxed, his expression pleasant. The face of a man who knows that time is on his side because every hour of delay strengthens his negotiating position. Crown Prince Adrian stood at the far end, in uniform, his hands flat on the table, his patience visibly disintegrating. 14 people, Adrian said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man who has been repeating the same number for 2 hours. 14 people are sitting in a burned-out warehouse in Thornwall with guns pointed at their heads, and this council is debating harbor tariffs. "The garrison reinforcement is a separate budget matter, Your Highness," Ashford said smoothly. "We cannot authorize military expenditure without a comprehensive review of the fiscal implications." "The fiscal implications of 14 corpses, Marquis. Would you like me to calculate that for you?" "Emotional appeals do not serve the interests of governance, and neither does letting civilians die to score political points." The door to the war room opened. Every head turned. Cedric Blackmore walked in. He was not dressed for the occasion. No formal coat, no crest, no cufflinks. He wore the plain dark coat of a man who had walked across the city on foot, and his boots were still spattered with mud from the streets. He looked like exactly what he was, a duke who had been stripped of his political power and had come anyway, because political power was no longer the currency he was dealing in. "Duke Blackmore," Ashford said, his voice acquiring an edge, "you no longer hold a council seat. This session is closed. I am not here for a seat." "Then you are here to waste our time." "I am here to offer the council something it does not currently possess, a solution." Adrian looked at him. The prince's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man who has learned to distinguish between allies and opportunists and is not yet sure which one he is looking at. "Speak," Adrian said. Ashford started to object. Adrian raised one hand without looking at him, and the Marquis fell silent, because whatever games were being played in this room, the Crown Prince still outranked everyone in it. Cedric stepped forward. He placed his hands on the edge of the table. He looked at each council member in turn. Some met his gaze, some did not. Ashford watched him with the patient hostility of a man who has already won and is curious to see the loser's final performance. The Thornwall hostage situation requires a rapid response force of at least 200 soldiers, deployed within 48 hours, supported by a supply convoy capable of sustaining operations for 2 weeks. The Council has been unable to authorize this because the garrison reinforcement vote is tied to the harbor tariff package, and neither side is willing to move first. "We are aware of the situation," Ashford said. "Then you are aware that I am offering to fund the entire operation, personally." Silence. Not the political silence of men calculating their next move. The genuine silence of men who have just heard something they did not expect. "The Blackmore estate," Cedric continued, "holds 3 properties in the Eastern March that are not subject to the current financial constraints: the Greystone Armory, the Blackmore Cavalry Barracks, and the Eastern Supply Depot at Heron's Cross. I am offering all 3 facilities for military use, along with 200 Blackmore cavalry currently stationed at the Eastern Garrison, fully equipped, fully provisioned, ready to move within 36 hours. "At what cost?" Ashford asked. "No cost." Another silence. "I am not negotiating," Cedric said. "I am not trading this for a council seat, or a concession, or a political favor. I am not asking for anything. 14 people are going to die if this council does not act, and I have the resources to prevent that, and I am offering them freely. That is all." Ashford leaned back in his chair. His expression had shifted from pleasant hostility to something more dangerous: uncertainty. A man like Ashford could handle aggression. He could handle manipulation. He could not handle sincerity, because sincerity had no handles. "This is a performance," Ashford said. "A desperate play by a disgraced duke trying to rehabilitate his reputation." "Maybe," Cedric said. "Or maybe I spent the last 6 weeks watching my entire life collapse and realized that reputation is just another word for the story other people tell about you, and the only story that matters is the one you can live with. I cannot live with 14 people dying while I sit in a room and count my losses. Call it whatever you want. I do not care anymore." Adrian watched him through the entire speech. The prince had not moved, had not spoken. His hands were still flat on the table, and his eyes had not left Cedric's face. "You said 200 cavalry," Adrian said. "Yes. That is not enough for a full extraction. No. It is enough for a perimeter and a supply line. The extraction requires infantry. Your infantry. I am giving you the support structure. You supply the spear." "And who commands the cavalry?" Cedric met his eyes. "I do." The room shifted again. Council members exchanged glances. Ashford opened his mouth to speak and then closed it, because even a man as polished as Marcus Ashford could recognize the moment when the ground had moved beneath him and the old map no longer applied. "You have not commanded troops in the field in your life," Adrian said. "No, but I have 200 men who have, and they will follow the Blackmore banner because that is what they swore to do. I am not claiming to be a general, Your Highness. I am claiming to be the man who shows up. For the first time in my life, I am claiming to be the man who shows up." Adrian studied him for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. 12 council members held their breath. Ashford gripped the arm of his chair with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles because he could feel the narrative slipping away from him, the carefully constructed story of Cedric Blackmore's irrelevance being rewritten in real time by a man who had walked in with mud on his boots and nothing left to lose. 36 hours, Adrian said. 36 hours. The prince straightened. He turned to face the council with the full authority of the crown behind his eyes. I am accepting Duke Blackmore's offer. The Second Army will deploy a strike force of 300 infantry to coordinate with the Blackmore cavalry. We move at dawn, day after tomorrow. Any member of this council who wishes to file an objection may do so in writing after the hostages are safe. He looked at Ashford. Or after they are dead. Your choice, Marquess. Ashford said nothing. Adrian walked around the table toward the door. As he passed Cedric, he paused. The two men stood side by side, the prince and the disgraced duke, and for one moment the distance between them was measured not in rank or rivalry, but in something older and simpler. If you get my soldiers killed, Adrian said quietly, I will end you myself. If I get your soldiers killed, Cedric said, I will deserve it. Adrian held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then he nodded, once, and walked out. The ride north took 31 hours. Cedric rode at the head of his cavalry column through rain that turned to sleet and then to snow as the elevation climbed toward the Thornwall Plateau. 200 riders behind him, men in Blackmore black on war horses bred for the eastern plains, their breath steaming in the frozen air. He had not ridden this hard in years. His thighs burned, his lower back screamed. The cold found every gap in his armor and settled into his bones, like a tenant that intended to stay. He did not stop. The landscape changed as they moved north. The green farmland of the central provinces gave way to the scarred, burnt terrain of the war zone. Shattered villages, blackened orchards, the skeletal remains of bridges that had been blown and not yet rebuilt. This was the world Serafina had lived in for a year. This was the world she had chosen over him, and riding through it, feeling the mud and the cold and the particular desolation of land that has been fought over and abandoned, he understood for the first time why she had made that choice. This was real. This was the actual texture of sacrifice, not the polished abstraction he had discussed in council rooms, but the literal physical reality of suffering, and the woman he had called unworthy had walked through it daily while he sat in a warm study calculating advantages. They reached the staging area 18 miles south of Thornwall at dawn on the second day. Adrian's infantry was already there. 300 soldiers in royal green dug in along a ridgeline overlooking the Thornwall Valley. The village was visible in the distance, a cluster of buildings around the destroyed field hospital, smoke still rising from the burned supply depot. Adrian met him at the command tent. The prince was in field gear, his face drawn with fatigue and the sharp focus of a man preparing for violence. Scouts report the insurgents have fortified the main warehouse, Adrian said, spreading a map on the makeshift table. 14 hostages in the central structure. Approximately 60 Cathani fighters. They have the building wired with explosives. Explosives? If we breach without neutralizing the charges, the building comes down on everyone inside. Cedric stared at the map. 60 fighters, 14 hostages, a building full of explosives, and 500 men waiting for orders in the snow. What is the approach? Two-pronged. Your cavalry secures the perimeter and cuts off the northern escape route through the forest. My infantry moves in from the south and east. We need a diversion on the western flank to draw their attention while a small team enters through the drainage tunnel here. Adrian pointed to a narrow passage on the map. The tunnel leads to the basement. From there, we can reach the explosives before they reach the trigger. Who leads the tunnel team? Adrian looked at him. I'm leading the tunnel team, the prince said. That is insane. It is necessary. The team needs someone the hostages will trust immediately. Someone whose face means stop fighting and start moving. That is me. If you die in that tunnel, the kingdom loses its heir. If those hostages die because I was too important to risk myself, then I am not worthy of being the heir. Cedric heard the echo. Not worthy. The same words he had used in a ballroom 2 years ago to describe a woman who turned out to be worth more than his entire empire. The words came back to him now like a knife he had thrown that had circled the world and returned to find his own chest. Let me lead the tunnel team, Cedric said. Adrian stared at him. You are the crown prince. The kingdom needs you. I am a disgraced duke with a collapsing estate and no political future. If someone is going to crawl through a drainage tunnel into a building full of explosives, it should be the man who has the least to lose. You have never done anything like this. No, but I have spent my entire life walking into rooms full of people who wanted to destroy me and coming out the other side. The rooms were just cleaner. Adrian studied him. The wind cut through the command tent, making the map flutter and the lamp swing on its hook. You understand that this is not a negotiation. There is no leverage in that tunnel, no strategy, no exit clause, just dark and concrete and the possibility that the next step you take is the one that ends you. I understand. And you are volunteering anyway. I am showing up. That is all I know how to do now. Adrian was quiet for a long time. The camp sounds filled the silence. Horses stamping, soldiers checking weapons, the low murmur of men who know that dawn will bring the kind of morning that separates the living from the dead. Dawn, Adrian said. Be at the southern perimeter at first light. Bring 4 men, the best you have. I will. Kedrick turned to leave. He was at the tent flap when Adrian spoke again. Blackmore. He turned. If you make it out, we are going to have a conversation about Serafina. If I make it out, I will welcome it. It will not be a comfortable conversation. I do not deserve comfortable. He walked into the snow. The night before the assault, Kedrick sat alone by a small fire at the edge of the cavalry camp. The stars were out, hard and bright and indifferent. Around him, 500 men slept or pretended to sleep, each one carrying the private weight of what tomorrow would bring. He took out Serafina's letter. He unfolded it. He read the 4 lines one more time, and this time he did not try to stop what his body did in response. His eyes burned, his throat closed, his hands trembled, and he let them tremble because trembling was honest and he was done with the alternative. She had ridden 3 days through frozen roads because she could not bear the thought of him dying alone. Tomorrow, he would crawl into a tunnel full of darkness and explosives, and he might die there. And if he did, nobody would ride 3 days for him. He had made sure of that. He had been thorough in his isolation, meticulous in his cruelty, surgical in his removal of every person who might have cared enough to come. He folded the letter. He placed it back in his breast pocket over his heart, and he sat by the fire and watched the stars and thought about nothing, which was the hardest thing he had ever done, because thinking about nothing meant being alone with himself, and himself was the one companion he had never learned to tolerate. Dawn came gray and cold and final. Kedrick stood at the entrance to the drainage tunnel. It was a concrete pipe, 4 feet in diameter, running beneath the warehouse floor. The air coming out of it smelled of stagnant water and rust and something chemical that might have been explosive residue. 4 Blackmore soldiers stood behind him, the best he had. Hard men with steady hands and the particular silence of people who have made peace with the possibility of not coming back. Above them, on the ridgeline, Adrian's infantry was in position. The cavalry had fanned out along the northern and western perimeters. The diversion team was ready on the western flank. Adrian appeared beside him. The prince looked at the tunnel entrance and then looked at Kedrick. 60 seconds after the diversion starts, you go. You have approximately 4 minutes to reach the basement and locate the explosive charges. My team breaches from the south at the 5-minute mark. If the charges are still live when we breach, everyone in that building dies. 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Kedrick looked at the tunnel. 4 feet of darkness. 4 minutes of life or death. And on the other side, 14 people who did not know his name and did not care about his title and wanted only to survive. He thought about 900-pound chandeliers. He thought about weight that refuses to bend. He had admired that once. He had modeled his entire life after it. Rigidity, mass, the refusal to move. But chandeliers do not save anyone. They just hang there, glittering, while the room burns. The diversion charge went off on the western flank. A thunderclap of sound and light that shook the ground and sent a column of smoke into the gray sky. Kedrick dropped to his knees. He crawled into the tunnel. Darkness swallowed him. Behind him, 4 soldiers followed. The sound of their breathing filled the concrete pipe. Ahead, nothing. Just black and cold and the faint drip of water, and somewhere at the end of this darkness, a room full of explosives and a choice that could not be calculated, could not be leveraged, could not be solved with strategy or mathematics, or the cold machinery of a mind that had spent 31 years solving for the wrong variable. The only equation left was simple. Show up, or do not. He crawled faster. Above him, the warehouse trembled. Gunfire erupted on the western perimeter. Shouts in Kithani, the sound of boots on concrete, running, repositioning, the frantic choreography of men responding to an attack they were not expecting from the direction it was coming. Kadric reached the end of the tunnel, a rusted grate. He kicked it once, twice, 3 times. The metal screamed and gave way, and he pulled himself through the opening into a dark basement that smelled of chemical accelerant and fear. He stood up. His hands were bleeding, his knees were raw, his heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his teeth. The explosive charges were stacked against the far wall. 6 crates, wired to a central detonator. A red light blinked on the trigger mechanism, steady, patient, counting down to a decision that someone on the floor above was about to make. 3 minutes and 40 seconds left. Kadric moved toward the charges. His soldiers spread out behind him, covering the stairwell, watching the shadows. He reached the detonator. He looked at the wiring. He had no training in explosives. He had no idea which wire to cut. He was a duke, a politician, a man who had spent his life in rooms with carpets and canapes, and he was standing in a basement full of enough explosive material to bring a building down on 60 fighters, 14 hostages, and 5 men in Blackmore Black who had followed him into a hole in the ground because he asked them to. His hands were shaking. 2 minutes. He reached for the wiring and heard a sound behind him. A click. The specific, unmistakable click of a weapon being armed. He turned. A Kithani fighter stood at the base of the stairwell. Young, maybe 20, wild eyes, a pistol in one hand and a dead man's grip on the railing with the other. He was bleeding from a wound on his shoulder, and his breathing was ragged, and his finger was on the trigger, and his eyes were locked on the detonator behind Kadric, with the desperate calculation of a man deciding whether to blow the building and everyone in it rather than let the enemy win. Kadric looked at him. 90 seconds. The fighter's hand trembled on the pistol. His eyes darted between Kadric and the detonator. His lips were moving, whispering something, a name. Someone he was thinking about in what might be the last minute of his life. Kadric raised both hands. Open. Empty. No weapon. No strategy. No leverage. Just a man standing in a basement, bleeding from his knees, looking at another man who was also bleeding, and between them the entire fragile, terrible machinery of what it means to be human and frightened and standing at the edge of something that cannot be taken back. "You do not have to do this," Kadric said. The fighter's eyes locked on his. 60 seconds. Above them, the breach began. Adrian's infantry hit the southern wall. The building shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere upstairs, hostages screamed. The fighter's finger tightened on the trigger. Kadric did not move. The fighter's breathing was the loudest thing in the basement. Ragged, shallow, the sound of a body running on adrenaline and terror, and the last fumes of conviction. His pistol was aimed at Kadric's chest, but his eyes kept sliding to the detonator behind him, and Kadric could see the calculation happening in real time. The terrible arithmetic of a man deciding whether one explosion is worth the silence it would buy. Kadric did not reach for a weapon. He did not have one. He stood with his hands open and his knees bleeding through his trousers and his heart slamming against the letter in his breast pocket, and he looked at the young fighter and saw something he recognized, fear wearing the mask of purpose. He had worn that mask his entire life. "You are thinking about someone," Kadric said. His voice was steady. Not because he was brave, but because his body had passed through the far side of fear into a territory where the nervous system simply gives up pretending and tells the truth. "The name you are whispering. Someone waiting for you." The fighter's jaw clenched. His hand trembled. The pistol wavered 1 inch to the left. "I am not your enemy," Kadric said. "I am a man standing in a basement who does not want to die. Same as you. Same as the 14 people upstairs. Same as every person in this building who would rather see tomorrow than prove a point." 30 seconds. The building shook again. Adrian's infantry was inside the upper floors now, boots on concrete, shouts in 2 languages. The particular chaos of a breach in progress, controlled violence crashing against desperate resistance. The fighter looked at the ceiling. He looked at the detonator. He looked at Kadric. "If I put this down," he said. His accent was thick. His voice was young. So young. If I put this down, they will kill me. If you press that trigger, you kill yourself and everyone else, including whoever you are whispering about. 20 seconds. The fighter's eyes filled, not with tears exactly, with the particular liquid brightness of a human being arriving at the edge of a decision that will define the rest of their life, however long or short that life turns out to be. He lowered the pistol. Kedrick moved, not toward the fighter, toward the detonator. He grabbed the central wiring harness with both hands and pulled. Not surgically, not with expertise or precision. With the brute, desperate strength of a man who has decided that if finesse is not available, force will have to do. The wires ripped free from the trigger mechanism in a shower of sparks, and the red light went dark, and the countdown that nobody could see but everyone could feel simply stopped. The silence that followed lasted 2 seconds. Then the basement door burst open, and Adrian's soldiers poured down the stairwell, weapons raised, voices shouting commands in crisp military cadence. The young Cathani fighter dropped to his knees and placed his hands behind his head and did not resist. Kedrick sat down on the concrete floor. Not a controlled descent, a collapse. His legs gave out, and he sat in the dust and the chemical residue and the blood from his knees, and he breathed. In, out, in, out. The air tasted like rust and gunpowder, and the raw animal sweetness of being alive when you had fully expected not to be. One of his soldiers appeared beside him. "Your Grace, are you hit?" "No." "Your hands, sir." He looked down. His palms were shredded from the wiring. Blood ran between his fingers and dripped onto the concrete in small, steady drops that made a sound like a clock ticking. "I am fine," he said. He was not fine. He was something so far beyond fine that the word had lost all meaning. He was sitting on the floor of a basement that should have been his grave, holding his ruined hands in front of his face, and feeling for the first time in his life the full, ungovernable weight of what it means to be a person. Not a title, not a strategy, not a 900-pound chandelier. A person. Fragile and bleeding and alive and terrified and grateful for every breath in a way that no amount of wealth or power or political leverage had ever made him grateful for anything. The hostages were brought out 20 minutes later. 14 people, blinking in the gray dawn light, some crying, some silent, all carrying the stunned expression of the recently saved. Adrian's soldiers wrapped them in blankets and moved them to the medical tents. The Cathani fighters who survived were disarmed and detained. The building was cleared. The operation was over. Kedrick sat on an overturned crate outside the warehouse and let a field medic wrap his hands while Adrian debriefed the commanding officers. The medic was young, efficient, and did not ask questions. She cleaned the wounds, applied antiseptic that burned like liquid fire, and bandaged each hand with the practiced speed of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "You will need stitches on the left palm," she said. "Some of these cuts are deep." "Later." "It should be now, sir." "Later." She looked at him with the patient exasperation of every medical professional who has ever dealt with a stubborn patient, and she moved on. Adrian found him an hour later. The prince was filthy, mud and gun residue, and someone else's blood on his uniform. His face was drawn tight with exhaustion, but his eyes were clear, and when he looked at Kedrick sitting on that crate with bandaged hands and mud-caked boots, and the expression of a man who has crawled through his own darkness and come out the other side with nothing left to prove, something shifted in the prince's bearing. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of hostility, which between these two men was practically an embrace. "The charges are confirmed neutralized," Adrian said. "All 14 hostages are alive. 3 of your cavalry took injuries on the perimeter, but nothing life-threatening." "Good." "The young fighter in the basement, the one with the pistol, he is asking to speak with you." "Why?" "I do not know. He asked for the man with the bleeding hands. I assumed that was you." Kedrick looked at his bandaged palms. "Later." "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." Adrian sat down on the crate beside him. 2 men on an overturned box outside a warehouse that had almost been a mass grave, watching the morning light spread across a village that had been saved and destroyed and saved again. "You were not terrible in there," Adrian said. "High praise from the crown. Do not push it." Silence. Comfortable, for the first time. The silence of men who have shared something that cannot be unsaid or undone or cheapened by analysis. We need to have the conversation, Adrian said. I know. About Serafina. I know. Adrian turned to look at him. I am in love with her, Blackmore. I want you to hear that clearly, so there is no ambiguity and no room for the kind of strategic maneuvering you are famous for. I am in love with her, not with her story, not with her gratitude, not with the political advantage of being associated with the most admired woman in the kingdom. I am in love with the woman who held my wrist in a barn and said I was not alone, and I intend to ask her to stand beside me for the rest of my life. Cadric listened. Every word landed in a place that was already raw, already open, already bleeding from 6 weeks of demolition. He felt each one. He did not deflect. He did not armor. He sat on the crate and let the words arrive and settle and do their damage, because the damage was deserved, and he was done flinching from things he had earned. She will say yes, Cadric said. You do not know that. I know her. Better than you think. I knew her for 6 years, Adrian. I knew the way she pulled her knees to her chest when she was thinking. I knew the sound she made when she laughed without performing. I knew that she organized medical supplies for flood victims because she could not stand the mathematics of suffering. I knew all of it, every detail, every texture. I knew exactly what I had. He paused. And I threw it away in front of 400 people because I was afraid that loving someone who saw through me would mean I could never hide again. Adrian said nothing. She will say yes, Cadric repeated, because you are offering her the one thing I never could. You are offering her the chance to be seen without being managed, valued without being leveraged, loved without conditions or calculations, or the constant terror of being found insufficient by a man who measured everything and understood nothing. He looked at Adrian. Take care of her, not because she needs taking care of. She is the strongest person either of us has ever met. Take care of her because she deserves someone who shows up every day, without strategy, without agenda, just shows up. Adrian held his gaze. Then the prince extended his hand. Cadric looked at it. A hand offered across everything that had divided them. Rank. Rivalry. A woman they both loved in different ways and with different costs. He reached out with his bandaged hand and took it, and the grip was firm and brief, and it hurt like hell because his palms were shredded, and he did not let go early. They released. Adrian stood. You are still a difficult man to like, Blackmore. I'm working on it. Work harder. The prince walked away toward the command tent. Cadric sat on the crate and watched him go, and felt the ache in his hands and the deeper ache underneath. The one that lived in the space where Serafina had been, the space he had emptied with 11 words and would carry empty for as long as it took to earn the right to feel something other than loss. He returned to the capital 4 days later. The ride south was slower than the ride north. His cavalry moved at a sustainable pace, giving the wounded time to heal and the horses time to recover. Cadric rode at the front and did not speak much, and his men did not question the silence because they had followed him into a tunnel and come out alive. And that kind of shared experience creates a bond that does not require conversation. The capital received them without fanfare. There was no parade, no ceremony. The Thornwall rescue was reported in the broadsheets, and Adrian was credited with the successful extraction, which was accurate and appropriate. Cadric's name appeared in a single paragraph near the bottom of the 3rd page, identifying him as the provider of cavalry support. He read that paragraph in his study and felt nothing resembling disappointment. The paragraph was accurate. He had provided support. That was all. That was enough. The weeks that followed were quiet. Quiet the way convalescence is quiet. Not empty, but slow, deliberate, the careful pace of a body and a life rebuilding from the inside out. Cadric addressed his financial situation with the brutal transparency he had learned in the basement in Thornwall. He met with his creditors face to face. He opened his books completely. He proposed a restructuring plan that was painful, honest, and realistic, and the creditors, who had been expecting the usual aristocratic theater of deflection and bluff, were so disoriented by straightforwardness that most of them agreed. He sold the Blackmore art collection. Not the townhouse. The collection. 47 paintings, 12 sculptures, a tapestry that had been in the family for a century. He watched the auction house catalog each piece and felt the particular lightness of a man discovering that the things he thought he could not live without were actually the things that had been weighing him down. He kept one painting, a small watercolor of the eastern provinces that his mother had done before she died. It was technically unremarkable. It was the only piece in the collection that had been made with love instead of purchased for status. He hung it in his study. It looked odd on the bare wall, a small rectangle of color in a room that had been stripped of everything ornamental. He looked at it every morning while he drank his coffee, and every morning it reminded him that value and price are not the same thing, and that the most important things in his life had always been the ones that could not be sold. Harlan, naturally, had opinions about the renovation. "Your study looks like a monk's cell," he said, settling into the chair that was now the only piece of furniture on his side of the desk. "It looks like the truth. The truth is ugly. The truth is honest. I have decided to try it for a while." "How is it going?" "Terrible. I recommend it." The news of Adrian's proposal to Serafina reached Kedrick on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Harlan delivered it, as Harlan delivered everything, with a glass of whiskey and the tactical sensitivity of a man diffusing an emotional explosive. He asked her this morning, in the royal gardens, white roses, lanterns, the whole production. Kedrick was standing at his study window. The glass reflected his face back at him, and the face was different now. The jaw was the same. The gray eyes were the same. But the architecture behind them had shifted. Something had been removed, and something else had been built in its place, and the new structure was not as impressive as the old one, but it was honest, which turned out to be more important than impressive. What did she say? What do you think she said? Yes. Yes. Kedrick nodded. He continued to look out the window. The city was green with spring. Trees along the boulevard were heavy with new leaves. A carriage passed below, and a child leaned out the window and waved at nobody in particular. "Are you all right?" Harlan asked. "No. But you will be. Eventually. Maybe. I do not know. I am learning to not know things, Harlan. It turns out that not knowing is a skill, and I am terrible at it, and I am practicing anyway." Harlan raised his glass. "To practice. To practice." They drank. The engagement was celebrated across the kingdom. Crown Prince Adrian and Lady Serafina Vale, the war hero and the woman who had saved him, the future king and the future queen. The broadsheets ran portraits. The public squares hosted gatherings. The story was perfect, a narrative of courage, redemption, and love that gave a war-weary kingdom something beautiful to believe in. Kedrick did not attend the engagement celebration. He sent a gift instead, not through an intermediary. He wrote a note himself, in his own hand, and attached it to a small wooden box containing the medical journal Serafina had kept during the war, which had been recovered from the Thornwall Field Hospital and preserved by the Veterans Relief Organization she had founded. The note said, "This belongs to you. It always did." He signed it with his name, not his title, his name. He did not receive a reply. He did not expect one. The wedding took place in autumn. The kingdom had never seen anything like it. Not because of the spectacle, although the spectacle was considerable, but because of what it represented. A future queen who had earned her place not through lineage or political arrangement, but through the simple, extraordinary act of showing up when people needed her. The crowds that lined the route from the palace to the cathedral numbered in the tens of thousands. Soldiers who had served alongside her stood at attention. Veterans from the Northern Campaign wore their medals and wept openly. Kedrick watched from a window in his townhouse. He could see the procession from the third floor, a distant ribbon of color and sound moving through streets that were filled with people celebrating a woman he had once called unworthy. He stood at that window for a long time. He did not cry. He was not sure he had that capability yet, but he stood still and let the moment arrive and pass through him without resistance. The way a man who has learned to stop fighting the current lets the water carry him. Not because he has given up, but because he has finally understood that some forces are larger than strategy and the only sane response is surrender. Below him, the procession turned onto the Royal Boulevard. He could see the carriage now, the white horses, the cascade of flowers thrown by the crowd. He could not see her face at this distance. He did not need to. He knew that face. He had studied it for 6 years and destroyed it in 11 words, and carried the memory of its final expression, that terrible quiet recognition for every day since. He hoped she was smiling. He hoped it was the real smile, the one that came from the belly and did not care who heard it. He stepped back from the window. He walked to his desk. He sat down in the chair that was now surrounded by bare walls and honest silence and the small watercolor of the eastern provinces that his mother had painted, and he opened a new ledger. Not a financial ledger, a personal one. He wrote the date. He wrote one line underneath. Today, I watched the best thing I ever had become the best thing someone else will ever have. And I am glad. Not because it does not hurt. It hurts in a way I did not know I was capable of feeling, but because the hurt means I am finally feeling something real, and real is what I should have chosen all along. He closed the ledger. He placed the pen beside it. He sat in the quiet of his study and breathed. Months passed. The kingdom settled into its new configuration. Queen Seraphina, as the people called her even before the coronation, became known for her work with veterans, widows, and the impoverished communities that had been devastated by the war. She established field hospitals in every province. She personally oversaw the reconstruction of Thornwall. She moved through the kingdom with the steady, unglamorous persistence of someone who understood that real change was not a speech or a policy, but a daily act of showing up. Adrian ruled beside her with the particular grace of a man who had found the person who made him better and had the wisdom to let her. He did not try to manage her. He did not try to direct her. He simply stood beside her and trusted her and loved her in the way that love works when it is not contaminated by fear or calculation, openly, consistently, without conditions. Kaedric rebuilt, slowly, painfully, without the old tools. The Blackmore estate stabilized under the restructuring plan, smaller than before but solvent, honest, sustainable. He lost the council seat permanently and discovered that the loss was not the catastrophe he had feared. It was a liberation. Without the seat, he was no longer required to perform. Without the performance, he was free to be what he actually was, a man of considerable intelligence and considerable damage, working through both with the awkward determination of someone learning a new language in middle age. He visited the Veterans Hall every week, anonymously at first, then less anonymously, because the veterans did not care about his title or his scandal. They cared that he showed up. They cared that he sat with them and listened to their stories and did not try to turn their suffering into a political talking point. They called him by his first name. He let them. He wrote to Seraphina once more, a year after the wedding. A short letter. Not an apology, not a plea. A report. He told her about the Veterans Hall. He told her about the restructuring. He told her about the painting on his wall. He told her that he had learned to drink his coffee without checking the morning dispatches first, which was the closest thing to personal growth he had managed, and he hoped it counted for something. She wrote back. 2 lines. It counts. Keep going. He placed the letter in the top drawer of his desk, next to her first one. 2 letters. 8 lines total. The most valuable documents in the Blackmore estate, worth more than the 47 paintings and 12 sculptures and century-old tapestry he had sold to keep the lights on. On a winter evening, 3 years after the night he had stood in a ballroom and destroyed a life with 11 words, Kaedric Blackmore sat in his study with a glass of whiskey and looked at the chair across from his desk. The chair where Seraphina used to sit with her knees pulled up. The chair where Harlan still sat, most afternoons, with his unsolicited opinions and his stubborn, indispensable loyalty. The room was quiet. The city was quiet. Snow was falling outside the window, and the flakes caught the lamplight and turned gold for a moment before they disappeared. He thought about weight. 900 pounds of chandelier. The weight of a dukedom. The weight of a letter. The weight of 11 words. He had carried all of it. He was still carrying it. The difference was that now he understood what weight was for. Not for impressing people, not for proving strength. Weight was what kept you on the ground. Weight was what made you real. Without it, you were just hanging from a ceiling, glittering, untouchable, and utterly useless. He finished the whiskey. He set down the glass. He looked at the small watercolor on the wall, the eastern provinces in his mother's hand, green hills and a blue sky and a world painted by someone who loved it. He picked up his pen. He opened the personal ledger he had started the day of the wedding. It was half full now, not with strategies or calculations or the cold arithmetic of power, with observations, thoughts, the small daily record of a man learning to be a person. He wrote the date. He wrote one line. 3 years ago tonight, I stood under a chandelier and held a glass and ruined everything I touched. Tonight, I am sitting in a room with bare walls and a borrowed painting and 2 letters in a drawer, and I am more than I have ever been. Not because I have more, because I finally know what I lost. And knowing what you lost is the beginning of deserving what comes next. He closed the ledger. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Alden Mere, over the palace where a queen was reading bedtime stories to her first child, over the Veterans Hall where men who had survived the war were sleeping in warm beds, over the grave of a boy from Thornwall who had not survived, whose name was written in a medic's journal in a wooden box in the royal apartments, over the eastern provinces, green even under snow, where a small duchy was learning to operate on honesty instead of leverage, and in a study that smelled of whiskey and old paper and the particular quietness of a man who has stopped performing, Duke Cadric Blackmore sat alone with his thoughts and his damage and his slow, imperfect, irreversible becoming, and he did not reach for the armor. He did not reach for the mask. He sat with himself, the most difficult companion he had ever known, and he breathed, and the breathing was enough, and the enough was everything. The lamp burned low. The snow kept falling, and somewhere in the silence between one breath and the next, the man who had spent his whole life refusing to bend finally learned that bending was not weakness. It was the only thing that kept you from breaking.